Mais on va reprendre la suite des conférences. Ça va être une partie assez technique. Donc finalement, on n'a plus qu'une seule conférence. On doit avoir une conférence sur l'éclairage qui est un élément indispensable pour la projection, mais voilà, on ne l'aura pas. Et on va plutôt aborder directement la conférence sur l'optique, qui est un élément voilà, qui demande beaucoup de connaissances, assez pointues. Il y a peu de chercheurs qui se penchent là-dessus. Et on a la chance donc d'avoir Dave Kenig qui va nous transmettre son savoir et les réflexions qu'il a pu faire au cours de ces 2 jours de laboratoire. Donc je vais présenter Dave Kenig en anglais. Donc désolée pour mon accent, parce que je suis très française, donc ça va pas être super. Dave, it's a true pleasure to present you, because we had a long discussion about technical problems, and it's a true pleasure for me. So Dave Kenig is currently employed in his 35th year at Panavision in Woodland Hills, California. He has contributed to the ASC manual, presented on CinemaScope at the Real Thing, Association of Moving Picture Archivists Conference in Los Angeles, and on Panavision lenses at the International Colloquium Voyage au Centre de la Machine Cinéma at the Cinémathèque Française, Paris. He is a member of the Conseil scientifique du Conservatoire des techniques cinématographiques de la Cinémathèque française. Et la conférence, your presentation talk about a brief history of early cinema lenses and parallel advances in optics design. So it's your turn.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to give this presentation. Cinema technology has been documented since its 19th century inception. By 1889, there were books and articles from several countries describing, 1899, there were books and articles from several countries describing cameras, projectors, printers, and perforators. Motion picture technical journals appeared several years after initial articles published in photography and lantern journals. While contemporary scholars have emphasized cinema aesthetics, style, structure, economics, and other areas for study, technology has taken somewhat of a back seat, with exceptions such as Raymond Fielding's publications. The study of cinema technology was left to collectors such as John Barnes, and we have distinguished collectors in the audience, and professionals who were fascinated by the history of the mechanics of cinema. Happily, this division is disappearing. The Academy is joining with professionals and collectors to examine cinema hardware, how it changed over time, and for what reasons. This conference is a welcome addition to the dialogue. In still photography, the development of the lens is well documented. Rudolf Kingslake has provided an excellent overview. Specific lens makers in the early lenses of France and Germany can be studied in recent publications. Recent publications and websites. For a study of lenses of motion picture cameras, on the other hand, one must consult many sources to compile even a brief overview, such as we will attempt in this presentation. This does not imply a paucity of information, but rather a lack of a comprehensive text. Advances in lens technology and cinema formed a symbiotic relationship in the late 19th century, which continues today in the age of digital image capture. In 1895, when members of the Photographic Congress appeared before the second prototype Lumiere cinematographique, the transition in image capture from what Lenny Lipton describes as the glass to the celluloid era had just begun. The large format plate camera for still photography required a long focal length lens which would cover the full area of the 16.5 centimeter by 21.5 centimeter glass plate. A long focal length lens that is suitable for a large format will produce a compressed perspective if used for a smaller format, as can be seen here. Notice that the line of passengers in the background appear to be foreshortened. On our next slide. There we go. The second prototype cinematographique used perforated 35 millimeter flexible celluloid film with an approximately 18 by 24 millimeter picture capture area. This format, adapted from Edison, was much smaller than the capture area of any commercial glass or film still camera of the time. For any photographic still format, the normal lens that will cover the field is based on the image diagonal. The larger the plate size, the longer the focal length lens. The quote-unquote normal lens gives an image that is approximate the perspective of the eye. A lens longer than the normal focal length will compress the perspective as the focal length increases. Perspective is also determined by the appropriate viewing distance from the print. The relationship of plate size, lens focal length, and print viewing distance is a basic photographic principle. Note that these numbers are approximate. Lenses made for large plate still cameras were not suitable for this new cine format with its small diagonal, not only because of their long focal length, but also because of size and weight. Some of the small still lenses were adequate for this new 35 millimeter cine format. They covered a quarter plate of about 3.25 by 4.25 inches, or 83 by 108 millimeters. However, the focal length of a normal lens for a quarter plate with a diagonal of 135.9 millimeters was about 5.3 inches, or 140 millimeters. Hence the apparent compression. Notice the span of the bridge at the top of the frame. This view was taken with a large plate camera with a normal focal length lens that matched the plate diagonal. Hence, the perspective is not compressed. Okay. So now we're moving on to the next phase. In 1891, W.K.L. Dixon was working at the Edison Laboratory with associates on a new vertical feed kinetograph camera designed to film subjects for the kinetoscope viewer. The camera required a lens with a much smaller image diagonal than existing lenses. This was effectively the new format that would become the 35 millimeter cinema standard. Dixon was very specific as to the field of view and subject distance requirement of the lens. One definition of focal length is the distance from the optical center of the lens to the image plane. In the picture on the left, the imager is a digital sensor, but the principle is the same for photographic film. The angle of view is the area that is imaged on the sensor, or that part of the image that the sensor records. The angle of view depends on the size of the sensor and the focal length of the lens. The field of view is similar to the angle of view, but is expressed as a measurement of the subject area rather than the angle. As an accomplished photographer, Dixon was familiar with these principles and used them to define the specifications for the lens for the vertical kinetograph. In July of 1891, the Edison Photographic Department received a copy of the 1891 Gunlock lens catalog. Later that month, Dixon traveled to Rochester and planned a visit to Gunlock. As Dixon recorded in his notebook, in September 1891, he sent a letter to Gunlock requesting a lens of 2 to 3 inch focus to cover a field of 30 feet at a distance of 25 to 30 feet. The image circle was 2 inches in diameter. From that, he would image on a 1 inch by 3/4 inch area. With slight modification, this would become the standard for 35 millimeter silent camera aperture. Motion picture subjects need to be in a space far enough away from the camera lens to allow for freedom of movement. The quote-unquote normal cine lens focal length is longer than the diagonal of the cine capture area. Dixon stated that he wanted his subjects to remain in focus as they approached or receded from the lens. At the time, lenses had average apertures of f6 to f16, depending on the coverage and type of lens. Since still plate cameras were focused by adjusting the bellows on the camera, most small plate photographic taking lenses were not built with a focusing device. Dixon did not have any method to vary the focus other than moving the camera fore and aft, so he relied on depth of field for a given distance and aperture to keep the subjects in focus. At the time of Dixon's request to Gunlock, there were 2 primary types of photographic lens in use. The first was the portrait lens based on the Petzval design of 1840, first manufactured by Voigtlander. The second was the landscape lens based on the rapid rectilinear by Dallmeyer or the Aplomat of Steinheil. Both landscape lenses appeared in 1866. Given Dixon's knowledge of photography, he would be aware that the Petzval portrait lens was not suited for this purpose because it was only sharp in the center due to excessive spherical aberration. This defect lent it to portrait use because the area outside and to the rear of the central subject was soft. This is far from the look that Dixon specified in his September 1891 letter to Gunlock. Petzval portrait lenses were designed for plate cameras and came in various focal length. The shortest version was about 5 inches. The rapid rectilinear landscape lens has a flatter field that met Dixon's needs. However, these lenses also came in focal lengths that exceeded Dixon's specification. In 1890, Ernest Gunlock patented this variation on the rapid rectilinear, which he branded as the Gunlock Rapid Rectographic Lens. In 1891, Gunlock published a catalog describing the new lens in some detail. Of the stock models, the smallest was the number 0, which covered a plate of 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 or a quarter plate at a focal length of 5 inches. This was not within Dixon's specification. On his revised drawing of September 25, 1891 to Gunlock, where he increased the object to focal plane distance to 40 feet, Dixon noticed a back focus distance from the lens to film plane of 1/2 to 3 inches. This shows, as Paul Spear states, that the camera was still a work in progress. Had the distance from the lens board to the film plane been established, Dixon would have specified a hard number for the back focus. After the initial 1891 specification, Dixon made several requests to speed delivery of a test sample. The correspondence shows Dixon's frustration in the delay. In March of 1892, Gunlock sent 2 lenses, one 2-inch or 50 millimeter and one 3-inch 75 millimeter. Dixon replied to Gunlock that he would keep the 3-inch lens. The Gunlock catalog states, special optical work made to order. Gundlach scaled the design of the rapid rectographic to fit the smaller 1 inch by 1 1/4 inch format within the image circle of 2 inches. This would have required new calculations, lens element manufacture, and a lens housing. The delay from September 1891 to March of 1892 would account for the time required to redesign and manufacture the 2 prototype lenses to meet Dixon's specification. Gundlach's invoice of July 8, 1892 states 1 RR lens number 445. John Belton, Paul Spear, Leah Jacobs, and Ben Brewster have researched Dixon's use of 35 millimeter width film. However, an explanation for the anchor 1.331 aspect ratio remains unclear. It is this author's conclusion that optics had no small part in Dixon's decision to employ the landscape format. Marketed in 1894, the Edison kinetoscope had a short 3-year life cycle. That's probably a bit generous. But during this time, in England and Europe, there was a demand for films other than those supplied by Edison. This led to other suppliers, such as Robert Paul, to develop a camera made to the Edison standard gauge. By 1897, when projection became the main form of exhibition, the market for films increased. Growth of the equipment industry was rapid, with a proliferation of numerous projectors from many countries. Exhibition was the main market, but cameras and lenses were needed to supply the content. Next part. While Dixon had the advantage of the Edison research facility to order a custom-made lens, in the formative years of cinematography, several camera makers had to choose from lenses designed for a small plate or hand camera. Georges Demeny employed a 120 millimeter Zeiss anastigmat for his short-lived biograph camera that used 60 millimeter unperforated celluloid film. The camera was marketed by Leon Gaumont in 1896. The Zeiss catalog of 1894 lists the Series 3 anastigmatic lens f7.2, designed 1890, available in 120 millimeter focal length. This lens would cover the large format 45 millimeter by 35 millimeter of the Demeny camera. Literature on 19th century cine cameras rarely mentions the type of lens that was used. Some extant examples, such as the Lumiere prototype number 2, have a lens that is not original to the camera. On other specimens, the lens is missing. This is not unusual, as these devices were often repurposed or modified. Parts were lost or used for some other application. Once a camera's historical significance became apparent, substitute parts were sometimes added to make the unit complete. There appears to be no record of what lenses were used in 1895 by Georges de Betz, it has no dates, in France for his kinetograph, which was marketed in 1896. By February 1897, when the Lumieres decided to make the cinematographique available for purchase, other camera manufacturers, in addition to de Betz, had preceded them. Gaumont had produced a 60 millimeter and 35 millimeter version of the Demeny chronophotography camera that used perforated film. The 35 millimeter version is equipped with a 50 millimeter Zeiss planar anastigmat. A 50 millimeter f4.5 series 1A Ross Zeiss planar is listed in the 1898 edition of the British journal Photographic Almanac. This is an early use of a focal length that would be adapted as the, quote, normal lens for 35 millimeter cine. The first commercial production Lumiere cinematographic models were supplied with a fixed focal length lens which was not branded. One possibility is the Voigtlander collinear, which was introduced in 1895. Later production units were supplied with a choice of two Zeiss types. The most common was a 54mm f6.5. This same lens was used in 1896 by Georges Méliès for his first camera constructed from a Robert Paul theatrograph projector. In 1898, Marion and Company of Soho Square, London, offered the Presswitch No. 2 35mm camera fitted with a Dallmeyer or Voigtlander special lens. In the early days of still photography, lenses were often constructed on an empirical basis from crown and flint glass. Optical glass is a specialized product, and only a few suppliers had the skill to produce acceptable melts that could be used for these lenses. Processes were well-kept trade secrets, and quantity was limited. Scientific investigations to improve the process of lens design and glass manufacture were mostly ignored by the practitioners or artisans. The name crown glass derives from the old process of hand-blown window glass. The point where the blowpipe was attached to the molten glass was thicker than the surrounding area. This area, the crown, had variations that gave it optical power. These were used to make some of the earliest lenses. The quality varied and no two pieces were identical. The term is now used in optics to describe a certain type of glass made from alkali line silicate and potassium oxide. It is a low dispersion glass with a low refractive index. Different types of glass bend light to smaller or larger angles. A measurement of the amount of bending is termed the refractive index. Glasses of varying refractive index are combined to form an optimal lens. Optical dispersion is the change of index of refraction with wavelength. The various colors travel at different speeds through the glass. One of the most common types of optical crown glass is the borosilicate type BK7. The term flint glass was used to describe a new optical glass that was used in the early 18th century, first by Hall and later Dollond, to make achromatic lenses. They needed a glass with a higher refractive index than the common window glass. This glass was made from broken flint with the addition of lead oxide. The lead increased the dispersion of the glass, which was needed for the achromatic lens. The glass was first used to make fine tableware, or what we now know as lead crystal. It was first manufactured in 1675 by the Englishman George Ravenscroft. By the early 1880s, two main suppliers of optical glass were Chance Brothers in England and File, later Paramantois in France. Germany's optical glass industry was in decline. Motion pictures arrived when major changes in glass manufacture and lens design occurred. As both are important in understanding subsequent developments, some background is in order. In 1840, the Hungarian mathematician and physicist Joseph Petzval designed his famous portrait lens. At an aperture of f3.6, the lens was 16 times faster than the earlier Wollaston Chevalier lens for the daguerreotype camera. Petzval calculated his design by geometrical optics. With its reduced exposure time, the Petzval lens took photography from outdoor landscape views to indoor portraits. Some 8,000 Petzval lenses were produced by 1850. While Petzval received little recognition and almost no financial reward for his work, later lens designers owe much to his application of scientific practice and optical design formulas. the term Petzval sum, one of the basics of lens design, is related to field curvature, honors his contributions. In 1857, the German mathematician Philipp Ludwig von Seidel published his paper which defined the aberrations that are a foundation of optical design and lens evaluation. With Seidel's work and that of other mathematicians, scientists, or natural philosophers, optics theory and lens design were in the mathematical realm. Later mathematicians who calculated the designs could not always produce lenses to the derived formula because available optical glass was not to the quality or type required. The existing formulas for crown and flint could not meet the specification. Optical glass was produced with limited materials and not made to scientific practice. Melts were inconsistent, and out of a given melt, only a few pieces were good enough to be later ground and polished to lens elements. The main suppliers of optical glass varied from England to the continent and back throughout the late 18th and 19th century. High-quality optical glass was required for non-photographic applications such as telescopes and microscopes. The 19th century was an age of great advances in science, and optical instruments were crucial to research. The German firm of Carl Zeiss and Jena was in need of quality optical glass for the manufacture of microscope objectives. Zeiss, trained as a precision mechanic, had produced microscopes since 1847. The objectives were made empirically, and by 1866, Zeiss could not compete with superior objectives supplied by another maker, Edmund Hartnack. In 1866, Zeiss hired physicist and optical scientist Ernest Abbe to calculate new objective designs. Abbe was inspired by the earlier research of glassmaker Joseph von Fraunhofer, who had made telescope lenses by calculation and secret artisanal methods. During his lifetime, Fraunhofer produced the highest quality achromatic optical glass for telescopes. In 1838, after his death, his secret methods were divulged by the son of a former colleague to the French. As a result, Germany lost its dominance in the optical glass market. By the 1880s, Germany imported optical glass from England, France, or Switzerland. Zeiss needed additional optical glass types to meet the specifications of the new objectives. Abbe looked to theory and scientific practice to improve his microscope objectives, and by 1879, Zeiss objectives surpassed the competition. What remained for Zeiss was the problem of relying on imported optical glass. This had political as well as economic implications. Zeiss petitioned the Prussian government, which supplied financial backing for the production of German optical glass. In 1882, Abbe collaborated with the German chemist and glassmaker Otto Schott. Schott and Abbe worked to create new glass formulas and standardized manufacturing methods which surpassed the imported product. A new firm, Jena Glassworks Schott and Genossen, was founded in 1885. This company, part of the Zeiss organization, now known as Schott Glass, became the major supplier for Zeiss and many other lens makers after the issue of their first glass catalog in 1896. This catalog listed 44 glass types. Several were new with a higher refractive index than the standard crown and flint varieties. Schott introduced the Abbe diagram, which plots the refractive index and dispersion of the particular glass type. The Abbe diagram has been adopted by all optical glass suppliers to the present day, and is revised as new types become available and older formulas are discontinued. The new Schott Jena glass allowed lens designers to meet the goals of their calculations. Germany soon became the main supplier of optical glass for the world. So I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but you can sort of get the idea. On the upper left is the type of glass, and it's plotted in terms of its refractive index, and the Abbey number or V number is plotted at the bottom. And at the time these were available, this is a fairly modern diagram because the high dispersion lanthanum glasses are in the upper right. If you find this a little too confusing, this Abbey diagram, we have the Aberdeen diagram. Okay. Next part. The introduction of new formula glass combined with the scientific approach to lens design led Zeiss in 1889 to hire mathematician Paul Rudolph to oversee a new photographic department. Rudolph in his long career designed numerous photographic objectives. Several were adopted by the motion picture industry. By 1891, what was known as Jena glass was so superior to other products that Zeiss licensed other lens makers such as Ross in England, Krauss in France, Bosch and Lomb in America, and Voigtlander in Germany to make lenses to their specifications. Thus, the Zeiss Anastigmat, designed in 1890 by Rudolph and later marketed in 1900 as the Zeiss Protar, became an early choice for cine cameras. The Anastigmat, made possible by the use of Jena barium crown glass for some elements, eliminated the astigmatism which was present in all prior photographic lenses. This was a major improvement in lens performance. The new Jena glass types became the choice for other designs. The science of lens design and optical glass manufactured paralleled cinema technology. One of the earliest books on motion pictures is Cecil Hepworth's animated photography, The ABC of the Cinematograph, published in London in 1897. In the advertising pages, there are lenses specifically aimed at the motion picture market by established English makers Dallmeyer, Ross, and Ray. Here, Dallmeyer offers a 2-inch, 50mm Type B taking lens. The Dallmeyer records show almost 70 B lenses produced between 1895 and 1901. This is notable for the early production date and demonstrates how quickly lens manufacturers responded to this new photographic format. Founded in 1850, Dallmeyer was absorbed into the Thales Optics Group, which is now the owner of Ingenue. Note the association and licensing agreement by Ross with both Zeiss and Goertz. Founded in 1830, Ross would last through mergers until the 1970s. Established in 1850, Ray would continue to manufacture still camera lenses into the late 1960s. Voigtlander of Germany offers 4 versions of the collinear cinematographic lenses at different apertures. The focal lengths listed are within what was to become the quote-unquote normal range for cinema. Both Dallmeyer and Voigtlander state that these lenses are for motion picture cameras. The other lens makers appear to be advertising still lenses from their product line that are suited for motion picture use. All of these suppliers were aiming to cater to this new market. As noted earlier, one could use some available still lenses for motion picture use, but as Dixon understood, it is best to employ a lens which is designed for the smaller format and diagonal. The 1894 Bosch and Lomb catalog lists the Bosch and Lomb Zeiss Anastigmat Series 2 F6.3, designed in 1891, number 1, which would cover a plate of 2 1/4 by 3 1/4. At a focal length of 3 3/8 or 85 millimeters, this was more suited to the 35 millimeter frame. Oh, I think I went too far. Sorry. The Zeiss anastigmat, while a great advance, had limitations, and in 1896, Rudolph calculated another design known as the double Gauss. By careful manipulation of the basic known design, Rudolph devised a new lens, the planar, which exceeded the performance of the anastigmat. By 1898, Bosch and Lomb offers the Bosch and Lomb Zeiss planar f3.6 Series 1A and notes, for making kinematograph and other negatives for the projection of animated pictures, these lenses are particularly well adapted, the smaller sizes having the requisite depth of focus and speed. The shortest focal length for this series was 4.5 inches or 114 millimeters, and a bit long. In 1892, mathematician Emil van Hoff designed an anastigmat that he later took to the form of C.P. Gertz in Berlin. The lens used a symmetrical pair of 3 elements and was first described as the double anastigmat Gertz at f8, but was later marketed as an f6.8 version. The name was shortened to Dagar in 1904. Gertz licensed the design to Ross. Some Lumiere and other early cameras were fitted with versions of this lens. Concurrently, Rudolph of Zeiss applied for a patent for an almost identical design. The history of motion pictures and other technology has numerous instances of dual discovery. This is not unusual, as parallel paths to discovery are often paved with the same stones. Lens development is no exception. These nearly simultaneous optical discoveries, similar to those in cinema development, have led to patent disputes, nationalistic favoritism, and acrimony. In 1895, Voigtlander patented the Voigtlander collinear, which is identical to the earlier 1893 orthostigmat from the firm of R. Steinhill in Munich. Kingslake notes that the two companies may have collaborated, as some versions of the collinear carried the Steinhill patent number. The collinear was one of the earliest lenses to be offered in cine format, as demonstrated by the Hepworth advertisement. In 1893, Harold Dennis Taylor of the firm Cook of York designed a still photographic lens which gave improved performance over the rapid rectilinear. This lens, with only 3 elements known as the Cook triplet, was branded as the Cook anastigmat, and the design remains today in many variations. Taylor's design method departed from conventional geometric optics in that he used algebraic formula and bench testing of a sample to prove out his design. The lens had a very flat field and good aberration control. The Cook triplet was a major contribution to optical design. Taylor received many offers for his distinguished career and many honors for his distinguished career in photographic and astronomical optics. Not offered in focal length suitable for cinema until about 1914, the Cook anastigmat was used on many cine cameras until it was surpassed by the Cook Speed Panchro series in the early 1930s. By the early 1900s, several firms offered lenses either designed or adapted for cine use. New models of cameras increased lens requirements. Before moving on to some of these later offerings, we should look at a very brief explanation of the lens design process. Next act. Lens design is a lengthy and costly process, so a need for a product must be first requirement. It can take several years to bring a lens from concept to market. The optical engineer must consider many specifications before proceeding with any new lens design. Here listed are some of the major factors to be considered. At the top of the slide, we can see the layout of Rudolph's planar design. The elements are identified by the type of glass, dispersion, thickness, and radius of the element surface. And you can see the symmetry in there And if you split it in the middle where the aperture is, you can see, and that's what's known as a double Gauss design. After the specifications are established, the designer will formulate the optical path. One method is ray tracing, used to compute the light path through the elements. In the 19th century, ray tracing was a laborious process involving numerous trigonometric calculations for each ray. Today, there are several computer programs that can perform ray tracing and performance analysis before commencing any actual lens construction. Lens elements are selected based on their ability to bend the light rays due to the refraction and dispersion of the ray as it passes through the glass. The type of optical glass, thickness, and shape of the element determine the path of the ray. Size and type of elements, radii, number of glass to air surfaces, and spacing are calculated. The final documentation is called the lens prescription. The prescription is similar to a list of ingredients in a recipe. The next step of lens construction is the optomechanical design. This defines all the parts in construction of the final product. Okay, now we're moving on to some actual lenses. In 1900, Hans Harnig of Voigtlander designed the f4.5 Heliar, which was influenced by the Cook triplet, but utilized symmetrical doublets as the front and rear components. The design was not very good, quote unquote, per Kingslake, so a new asymmetrical version was offered in 1902. The Heliar was supplied by Pathé for the studio professional camera for many years. The lens was reformulated several times in an f3.5 version, in 1 5/8 2-inch and 3-inch for cinematography was offered in the 1920s. The 1901 E. Krauss catalog recommends the Series 1A Krauss planar lenses in 5 focal lengths from 35 millimeter to 75 millimeter for cine. Now, when it says 35 millimeter, that's probably for a substandard format and not for 35 millimeter diagonal, because that's a little too early for a wide-angle lens. In 1902, Rudolph improved on his 1899 Unar and astigmat design with the 3-group 4-element Tessar. This lens used in a cemented doublet in the rear with a positive front and a negative element in the middle, which you can see in the diagram. The first version had an aperture of f6.3, but faster f3.5 and f4.5 versions were available by 1907. The Tessar was one of the most successful lens design in many versions for all formats. As with the earlier anastigmat and planar, Zeiss licensed the design to the same manufacturers. In France, the Krauss Zeiss Tessar was supplied with several cameras, including the Pathé and Debris. Derivatives of this design were offered by many other makers. The 1907 Zeiss catalog lists the Series 1C f3.3, f3.5, 50 millimeter, and 75 millimeter as recommended for cinematographic work. In 1910, Emil Busch of Germany listed the Glaucar anastigmat f3.1, quote, for cinematographic picture taking, in 5 focal lengths from 2 3/8 or 60 millimeter to 4 1/8, 105 millimeter. So you can see by this time we're offering a wider variety. And note that this period, the speed of cine lenses had increased from f5.6, f7 to 3.1 to 3.5. This is mainly due to improvement in better lens design and also optical glass. The 1913 Goertz catalog offers the new Kino Hypar f3.5 for motion pictures, which was a modification of their larger portrait Hypar series for still cameras. So you can see, just like Gunlock did for Dixon, you could scale down the lens design for a different format. These lenses were supplied by Bell & Howell for many years for the studio professional camera known today as the 2709. The 1914 Cooke catalog has a page for their Series 2A f3.5 cinematograph lenses based on the triplet design. Cooke may have been supplying these OEM camera to OEM camera makers prior to this notice. This is an area for further research. Note how pictures of subjects frozen in motion were selected to demonstrate the speed and reduced exposure time needed for lenses and still cameras at the time. Increased speed of film stock also contributed. These pictures would not have been possible were it not for the developments in glass, film stock, and lens design which coincided with the advent of cinema. The war put a stop to glass imports from Germany and further consumer lens development. Optical glass was needed for the war efforts on all sides. New cinema lenses were introduced after 1919, but we must save those for another time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Y a-t-il des questions? Enfin, c'était très
Ready to
pointu.
escape any?
Est-ce que quelqu'un a des questions?
No questions? Okay.
No, c'est bon. I guess it's a very, very naive question. I don't know anything about lenses, but I'm curious. You spent some time in the collection. You looked at the lenses here on the cameras. And did you encounter on the cameras here on the projection on the lenses any evidence that the lenses were modified in some way by the users? And more broadly, more generally, was it something that's early cinematographers in the period that you're covering would do? Like, would they intervene or modify lenses in any way, or would they just buy a lens and?
Well, I'd say a general modification of lenses is sometimes, we do it today all the time, but at that time, it's my belief that most of the optical were done with supplemental devices. And in the next part, if I get to the next part of this journey, we'll talk about soft focus lenses. But these lenses and the ones I saw in the collection, fortunately, most of the cameras I looked at looked like they had the original lenses. The Pathé Professional had a Zeiss, Kraus Zeiss Tessar, which is very typical for a camera, for Pathé to use that at that time, just as an example. And the Debris Parvo, I believe, has a Kraus Zeiss Tessar on it. So I didn't see much, but there were some cinematographers who would do things to change a lens. You can always, those lenses are relatively simple, so you can take them apart or you can extend them. One example of doing something with a lens, if you've seen Williams, The Big Swallow, that wouldn't have been possible without having some sort of bellows or something on the camera, because as you notice, the subject gets closer and closer to the camera while a lens couldn't focus. So you'd have to extend it and figure out a way to extend the lens away from the camera to get that shot. And I'd like to know how Williamson accomplished that. It's sort of a roundabout way. Any other? Okay. Well, thank you again.